Thank you all for taking your Rose Parade Saturday to join us in sitting in two exhibitions with two artists. I asked Liz if I could introduce Mark because we have a history which we'll talk more about. But Mark is an artist and educator that once blew wind into my sails to become an artist and continue to do so and inspire me. Mark's shown here since 1997, but also internationally in various institutions from Artist Space in New York, the Drawing Center, somehow showed at the Hoffman Gallery 3 times, which is pretty impressive. Merrillhurst Art Gym, Portland Art Museum, it goes on and on. I think there was a moment in time in which I thought I was like the sole interlocutor of Mark's work, which wasn't true, but there is times in which Mark was the sole interlocutor of the work in which I made. And I think that I became a better, smarter, and more curious artist from that. Duchamp once said that Seurat was the only retinal painter in the 19th century. I read once that Seurat never made prints. I don't know if this is true or not, but thinking about it, I think that printmaking and photography were so central to that practice that it would undermine his painting practice. And I bring this up because I think that things that really count or matter in painting or art making often come when an artist takes one format, one platform, one type of discipline, and transfers it into another one. Mark's work's continually done that over time as I've watched it, looked at it, spent time with it. His method of impregnating recycled fabric and applying it to painting, where the fabric lays completely flat, it almost avoids gesture or the artist's touch in a certain way, but it creates a type of ambiguity and openness that allow us to move, think, and contemplate what the works are about. Mark's dedicated his work not only to the optical and retinal, but to craft, to textiles, to the community, to the way in which we see and move through the world as humans. I'm always fascinated about Mark's history. Mark's been doing community-based art, which is now called social practice, before it was cool or had a name. And his works opens up all these dialogues, not only within the pictorial plane, but outside of that, to the spatial structures in which complicate our lives in the everyday world, from stadium formats, to the hives, to the Silk Road, to the brain, and other sorts of networks in which we find ourselves living complicated lives. So I kind of want to ask Mark a question to start, which is kind of where ambiguity kind of lies within the work and how you hope or expect viewers to kind of complete a work in a way. Because I think we're both kind of Duchampian in the sense that we also feel like the viewer kind of completes the work.
Yeah, I guess when I think about an audience for the work, well, ultimately I'm making me happy, or trying to keep busy at least. But when I think about the audience, I'm hoping that there's some engagement through process. And we talked a little bit about, both of our works, both of our approaches here really are about really engaging with the idea of perception. And so when you look at Derek's work, you see one thing, initially, but then if you care to look for a little while, then it starts to unfold, and it starts to become something much different than what you might initially perceive. And the same with my work. I think it starts with a gesture, and you see a gesture, you see a very graphic shape, and if you care to engage, then you begin to notice, oh well, it's this shape. The shape kind of encapsulates all this activity. So there's this kind of system, this network happening, and then all this minutia that goes into creating this overall structure. So when I think about, and I'm not sure if I'm even answering Derek's question correctly, but when I think about how, in terms of how somebody's going to perceive or engage with it, it's through process where I'm hoping that you see one thing initially, and then if you go closer or you stay a little bit longer, then all this other stuff is going to unfold, particularly, and the process is very straightforward. It's all about taking a strand like a stripe, and all my life I've just been enamored with stripes. A uniform thing, I don't know, regalia, but you take a stripe and it doesn't really mean anything on its own, but then if you manipulate the stripe and turn it into a circuit, so here's the stripe, then you cut the corner of the stripe and turn the corner and another corner and another corner, and you complete a circuit, it becomes whole. And then of course those sorts of circuits interact with other circuits, and then it kind of telescopes inward, and then you have this underlying structure that informs this larger thing that maybe one encounters initially. And in terms of the viewer, I hope the viewer can take it a few different ways, hopefully. And I'm not insistent that they read it in a particular way, but I'm hoping that people can engage with just that process and then find a way into it and be affected by it.
Yeah.
In terms of your work, Derek, it's funny, my work is so graphic. It's just what you see is what you see until you maybe look more carefully. Derek's work, I think Derek is very much engaged with perception, but his work is in the act of becoming or disappearing. But I feel like you're after a similar thing. You want there to be, you're asking for maybe a closer examination. And that's a really difficult sort of thing to get now, because most things are seen digitally, and it's very, if we get ourselves to the gallery and experience the work, there's this whole other world that unfolds. But
yeah. And I think there's a certain, I would call it like a distance being important, right? For me, I think it's like, that thing you're talking about with viewers coming closer, falling back, like a literal physical distance is very important for seeing. And I think there's also like, for me, there's like the offering of a type of gratification or seeing, and then like pushing that away and then reintroducing that. And then also through, which I think is something we both have in a certain way, like the lowest common denominator of painting or making, which is like still life, collage or photo montage, which I think like people can resonate with in a certain way. But also there's like a challenge to that in like a subtleness, which is that like, and like Cezanne, like if you think about Cezanne's early work, where like about really graphic and intense things like rape, extreme violence, other things like that. And then somehow he figured out how to like put all that into a piece of fruit,
Uh-huh.
right? So how do you like, also embed meaning within those structures
Right. Right.
that resonates like, I think we were talking yesterday about like an interior subjectivity that then gets like fractured and like released into an exterior one that people could then relate to their own interior subjectivity.
Uh-huh. With your work, there's literally in terms of this imagery that you're working with, there's history as well. There's a contemporary element, and then there's something that you read as kind of an artifact.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think there's like the artifact of the old and new, which is something we do every day as like artists, or we should do, right? Is what we carry this history of painting, image making, world histories, and then we try to find a way in which we can speak about how it relates to how we exist in the world today. And I think there's like a literal bridge within that, and I'm also interested in how objects or images can kind of transfer that back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Could you both speak up a bit?
Yeah, sorry about that.
I was thinking the same.
We'll raise it
I'm
up.
in the front row, so the microphone's amplified for the camera, not for the,
Yeah.
Oh, so if I did this, it wouldn't make any difference. Okay.
it's just for the camera.
I will project. So I want to talk about, Derek was so kind to write or think about an introduction for me. Just for people that don't know us well, Derek is my former student. I was teaching at Portland Community College. I was there many, many years. Derek showed up one day. He had come from work, I think, and Derek was a sheet metal fabricator, and often when he come to class, he would be still in his work clothes. So he'd just show up, ready to go, but he was the most inquisitive and curious student I believe I ever had, and was able to just work through things quickly and move on, and then kind of put that in his, put that in his pocket, put it in as kind of like this, level of understanding, kind of hold that, and then move on to something else, and then come back, kind of cycle back. But his interests were so wide, and his curiosity was so intense that it was just amazing. And he's kind of continued that into his present life as not only a practicing artist but a curator at Reed College. Artist curators are a rare breed. Someone who has enough interest to be curious about other people's work, but then will also have enough time to make his own work, which is amazing. He's the director at the Cooley Gallery at Reed College. He's also director of a gallery, the Southeast Cooper Gallery that he has at his own residence. And you're just a multifaceted person, and I don't know really how you do it, but it's been amazing to watch Derek just grow as an artist and have such an effect on the community, and to make so many friends and to foster so many careers, and it's really wonderful. Derek, too, is just most recently a recipient of a Hallie Ford Individual Fellowship, which is wonderful. I see a former student who is very important, I think, to Derek's development, Jeremy LeGrand here in the audience. Hey, Jeremy. But
Yeah.
Jeremy can Jeremy can attest to some of these qualities in Derek. But I guess the point, the kind of rambling introduction I was making for Derek is the point that I believe that you come at making work from many different points of view, and that you have so many, you're so engaged with so many different methods and approaches to art making, and in thinking about other people's work in relation to your own, that I think you're able to see things in really multifaceted ways, and I think that's evident in how you approach making the work that you're making now. I'm curious though. I believed that you were kind of interested in initially fabrication, kind of like material things, and you seem to have evolved more toward, lately at least, toward painting. Although there's always another element. There's always a lens. There's always a way of framing element that will contextualize the paintings. But maybe you could talk about your work in relation to if you haven't been into the other gallery yet, there are these columns of, they're bronze sculptures. They're floor to ceiling, and they're essentially recorders that have been cast and then stacked end to end. How do those relate to, how would you like those in terms of their relationship to the paintings to resonate with people?
Yeah. I guess I could first just talk a little bit about painting.
Uh-huh.
I've always made paintings, but they always came from kind of, at least like post-school paintings, came from like kind of a post-painting perspective, especially since I like went to school at the like kind of critical theory, CalArts feminist Marxist boot camp school for a while, where like painting was not cool because it had like entered a marketplace, right? And then like new media was like the thing to do, which was like oriented in like commercial market capitalist critique. But then I think really it's just like there's less of a history for that work to set beside. So it also becomes like a easier methodology in which you could like possibly produce something that like goes beyond what's happened before. And now I think that I'm like interested in like how complicated this like story of painting, image making that humans have doing, and how long and vast it is, seems like a more complicated thing to like crack or figure out or work within. So I think that's kind of what's like got me really curious and like focused on painting recently. I think there's also a thing where at that time there was a moment in which like a photograph was the truth, and then that was like no longer a thing, right? There's Photoshop, there's all these things. And then there was a moment in which like moving image or video was truth. And then now we no longer have that. And like AI kind of like really complicates images in a certain way. And I think that I was really interested in how painting is like both banal in certain ways and radically specific at the same time, and has a type of material and time that like goes beyond that like framework. But I think all that said, I really come from a image theory in a certain way, or like a history of images and thinking about like critiquing images, thinking about where they come from, who makes them, what they're trying to tell us, who's trying to tell us what through an image. And kind of part of that is also the speed and distance in which we look at images now and trying to slow that down. I think there's a speed thing too that I'm interested in, and a slowness within painting.
That's a really good point. I feel like that's, for myself, that's the whole struggle. How do you slow down the process of looking? And, because, things are just consumed in just nanoseconds. And can it even be done? And it might be a, it almost feels like a fatal kind of challenge, to actually try to operate in that way. But there's got to be, to me, there's always been something in that physical connection with making, and the physical connection that you see, where you're engaging in person with an object, with an artifact. It doesn't have to be a painting. It doesn't have to be a sculpture, but anything made by human hands that engages this kind of love and ritual, this process, one has to just keep trying, right? It's just kind of this eternal interest of mine. Like I got to keep trying,
Yeah.
to engage in that way, and there are so many contradictions that you come up against in trying to pursue that challenge, but it feels like it's worth it.
Yeah. So I think there's a thing, well, you asked me about the sculpture, and
Yeah.
I think there's always a thing which is also like the challenge of painting, in which I'm interested in like the exhibition as like a theater set where
Uh-huh.
the viewers are the actors in a certain way. We're thinking about like the way structures of architecture move people through spaces and other things, and I think there's elements of that in the painting. I hope there could be.
Uh-huh.
I think that's like something that's like complicated to figure out, right? Like how could you make a painting that does like what a sculpture does to
Right.
you, like physically and within a space, and makes you move around it. And I think that you
And
talk
you're-
about that in like a different way in your paintings,
Uh-huh.
right? So, and there's like a line where you talked about a stripe earlier, where it goes from like a maypole gathering to like stadium seating charts as format for painting to like the Silk Road, and now to like the brain.
Those are brains over there.
Conversation of ecocide, and kind of how we move through those spaces, whether they're physical or like a digital realm.
Uh-huh.
So I'm also curious about how you go from like really community centric to then like Silk Road as like a line. That's an interesting line to me, and then back out to.
Well, the Silk Road, so Derek's referring to a show that I did, I don't know, 10 years back or more. And it was, so the Silk Road, I was thinking about the ancient Silk Road and obviously these trade routes and so on. But I was thinking of this internet community, in the dark web, where there was a kind of marketplace for illicit, illegal substances. That was, kind of a whole Silk Road, a whole community of exchange, but all through the internet. So it was more of it was a mental kind of process, and a mental trade route or a virtual trade route, as opposed to the ancient literal trade route where, ships would go and trade and so on. It's interesting that these, I have these things over here, I think of them as meanders, but they are like those trade routes. It just occurred to me that, oh yeah, I'm quoting myself in making these works. I'm just going to kind of just go off for a minute.
Yeah, do it.
Just to give everybody more context. These meanders here, these kind of, it's like a gesture, just back and forth, back and forth. When there's always organic or a natural equivalent. I'm always looking for equivalencies. So there's this natural equivalent, like a river, or perhaps an ant colony that's like, kind of making its way, or a foraging party, or a highway. And then, and more, specifically about culture, we have this cultural drift, and we, depending on, at least in the U.S., depending on the administration, we prioritize certain things and then we don't, Whoever's elected, will prioritize climate, incentives to, slow climate warming, and currently we don't have that. We have, it's suddenly not an issue. So I was thinking about the cultural shifts in that way, how we meander back and forth, and then how just an individual navigates, how one operates, just from an existential point. How do you survive with this kind of dread, that you live with often concerning bigger issues. And so these are sort of like systems turned into an organic kind of form. So like a brain, where we process things with the amygdala, that little center of fear and so on, or fear, emotions, the emotional center of our brain. My wife Maria actually coined that for me. She said, "You're making brains. You're talking about, fear." And really, I am. But also, it's this kind of sense of like, how do I create order in this system that I can't manage? That's overwhelming to me. How do I create order? How do I find some sort of, sense of stability in that overwhelming system? So that's, with those work, that's kind of the direction. With these, you can kind of see these might be components within these larger, kind of more landscape-oriented environments. But these are inspired by, Derek mentioned stadiums, collective dwellings, apartment houses, communities, just blocks of people, but also colonies of aquatic creatures. If you see a rock in the tide pools and you look at the little mussels and the barnacles and the anemones, how they kind of form. They're bigger, they're larger, closer to where the nutrients are, like the water. And then as you get up towards the top of the rock, they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But you start to really recognize these microcosms that occur out of the world as I encounter it. And then also from a cultural standpoint, how do I operate? How do I operate when there's so much, dread and fear? How do I find some kind of way through? So that's kind of the essence of these. But getting back to this question of, I think Derek got me onto a tangent, just the idea of like how there's movement in the work. In your paintings, you're using apertures. Would you say? I mean, you're going in. With mine, you're not really going in, but you're going around. You're circulating through. yours are going in and then start circulating back out again. At least that's how I'm reading them.
Yeah. I've always been really, well, first I think when I first saw your paintings, I thought about ant hills or ant farms. I thought about ant hills or ant farms, and Mitch Hedberg said I bought an ant farm once and those fuckers didn't grow shit.
Well, yeah, they don't have a queen. It's
No.
hard to do anything. Derek, I want to repeat that. Derek said, because that's a really good point. Derek bought an ant farm. You know, was it a doctor?
It's a Mitch Hedberg said
Okay.
that.
Yeah, and you don't get a queen, so then they just die out. All they do, what they do is just bury one another. Yeah, as they, so you need a queen to really get stuff accomplished.
Yeah. That's true.
So go ahead.
That's too true. Yeah, so I think before that we were talking about apertures, spotlights, figure foreground. I think that's something that's been present in my work for probably, I don't know, 15 years or something. And I think for me, it's like, in a literal sense, it's Breckian in a certain way, thinking about like maybe a fissure, a notch, a crack, where you can like see behind the scenes for a second. So bringing like the history of a painting, or at like certain times there's even like the underpainting coming all the way forward, and then like using digital prints over paintings to like go back at certain points. But that's always been kind of a preoccupation of me within painting, is like that push and pull of like also thinking about like images, how they are produced, like what's in the background, what are we not seeing, what's the activation, what are we supposed to see. So that really functions in that way for me, thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it also helps in that idea of like distance, movement, time, slowness that I wanted to have in the paintings. And I've always kind of wanted to like activate a viewer and looking in a certain way.
Right. So you're slowing down, looking.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's also with me. That's an interest. I'm interested in making it about real time. You know, like if one can kind of slow down and actually see the process that unfolds, the making process unfold, then you're slowing the viewer down a little bit if they start kind of circulating through in that way. Like, how's this made? How's that put together? Or how's this edge? Is this object? Is the space coming forward? Is this space going behind? How's this all put together? So.
And I think in like the most ideal way, it's like getting people to look longer at anything, to have like an openness to like, just a general openness to like look and think and like not react so quickly, not have like judgment so quickly. I think that if we like all looked at a blade of grass for like 2 hours, we'd like probably like think about the world differently.
You might see it actually grow a little bit.
Yeah.
Pay attention long enough.
But it's about giving time and care.
Right.
In a way, right?
Right.
And that's like outside of like art, but also just like other humans looking at the world and with more time and precision and keeping the cave open before you like roll the boulder in front of it.
Uh-huh. Well, we should probably take some questions, right?
Yeah.
And there was one final point I wanted to make. it's so interesting, the contrast between my work, which is so graphic, and Derek's work, which is visually very ephemeral, but we're really kind of we're going at the same thing, like,
Yeah.
which I find really interesting. But
That's true.
anybody have questions?
I have a question.
And we'll repeat your question when you ask it, so then the
Okay,
microphone.
so this is for you, Mark.
Yeah.
Earlier, you were talking about the challenge to focus on an image or a situation, and you said that there was constant contradictions. So I was curious what those contradictions are. I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm not sure.
So the question is, what were the contradictions that I had referenced earlier in just making work?
You were talking about the challenge of focusing on a particular image or situation.
Right. So thank you, Renee. So the contradictions between focusing on a particular image or situation. And to answer that, I'm not sure I really know. And I feel like what I was, I guess, referencing in terms of the contradictions were just what we're trying to do as artists in making. We're engaged with this idea of really getting people to focus and slow down and look, but we're also, by doing so, we really limit our audience. You know, if we're lucky enough, what we make is disseminated, and you know, people will see it. Maybe it's in an institution, or maybe we're lucky enough to get a show in a gallery or museum, which you know, which isn't the case for a lot of artists. So I guess the contradictions would be that it feels like sometimes like we're doing a very rarefied thing, or very it's sort of a chaotic task to do that, even though we're talking about big ideas, but then sometimes it feels like we're by doing what we do, we're potentially limiting our audience, but then we feel it's important at the same time. It feels very necessary. I'll go in, I'll see like a textile from the Mughal dynasty in India, in the museum, in the Metropolitan Museum, and that whomever made that textile, probably devoted years to it and never got a lot of credit for having done it. And the way museum credits these older artworks and artifacts, sometimes the artist isn't even named. But I'm so happy that that person did it. They did it in silence. They did it in privacy. Somehow it lasted, all of these years, and then they can have an effect on its audience. And so I feel like we're doing that here. Very few things maybe they're all part of the conversation, but then very few things actually get to be seen by a lot of people. I think that was the contradiction that I was mentioning.
I think maybe you're saying it's a fool's errand, but nevertheless we persist.
Right, fool's errand.
So you both have a relationship, I think, in your work to the everyday. In some cases that's through materials like old clothing or upholstery fabric, or the imagery of food, or everyday things that we all encounter. But you both also mentioned ritual at various times in what you've said today. And it makes me think of art historian Ellen Dissanayake in her book Homo Aestheticus, about how the urge to make special was the thing that allowed humans to evolve out of caves. So can you talk a little bit, and both of you have this idea about care and a larger context, and I'm kind of rambling a little bit. Can you talk about how your work relates to the everyday and ritual?
Well, I think they were even trying to make the cave special, right?
Yeah.
And they were making paintings and making objects and making little tiny things in which they would carry around to protect them or like incite memory or like the ideas around time are different, but like Aboriginal paintings in the dirt or hieroglyphics or other things, right? So there was always like there's always been a thing that's like ritual, making something special, food, sleep, shelter, water. And I think these are also the sites in which we experience the emotional spectrum and what it means to be alive and figure out what that's even supposed to mean. So I think that's where it comes from in my work is those things, thinking about that, right? And Mark had like asked me about poetry. It's like The Poet's Lips is the title of the show. There's this Kierkegaard quote, which is really about like, also like a Langston Hughes thing, which is like also all art, which is like we can't see beauty and joy without also experiencing the suffering. And there's like all sorts of spectrums in between that. But yeah, finding ways in which we can make images, pictures, spaces that connect us in those kind of ways, where we can like heal and experience joy, right? I often talk about like trauma and trauma being passed down through DNA, but also like if we believe that, we have to believe that like joy, something truly inspiring, can also do that. And so I think that's why humans continue to do that. I don't know, now I'm rambling, but
That sounds good to me. And, in the end, it's a very positive act. It's survival, you know. It's fulfilling this really basic need, and you know, it's good that you brought that up. And you know, I wouldn't be doing it if it weren't about that. Ultimately, you know.
I think we like to pretend and like over intellectualize that art's like not Eros and Thanos or like death and birth and all those things, but it is kind of like always remains a little bit of all those things and in between.
Uh-huh.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Mark specifically?
Pardon?
Can I ask a follow-up question to you specifically?
Okay. Yeah, and then Stephen had a question.
So, you're making these works with fabric, right? So, but you could also make this with paint. So can you, well, I guess you use fabric and paint, but can you talk about why the choice to use a recycled material?
There was never an idea that I needed to use fabric to talk about. I was never trying to comment on the process of painting. I was always just drawn to fabric, and it was just forever. You know, I grew up in a family. There's always a quilt around. There's a materiality to fabric. Like if you cut the fabric, it's the same color all the way through. You know, that's kind of what it accepts light in a really interesting way. It's very rich. It doesn't really reflect. You know, it kind of absorbs light. So just a kind of physical, tactile thing. But as a painter, but I think ultimately I really arrived at use of fabric just because I loved its qualities so much, but also it was a way to avoid self-erasure. As a painter, everybody falls into patterns, and in my own case, I couldn't accept a mark from a brush, where with fabric I developed kind of a means of having to make a piece, make a shape or a cutting or whatever, and put it down, and then it just had to be that, and I had to just accept it. So ultimately, it was about a kind of survival, and to so take maybe a perceived weakness or a perceived problem, but then and turn it into something that was a positive. Work with your limitations and then make it, turn it into something you can really develop and present your best self with. But that, and also I just had a thing about uniforms and stripes and costuming, and it was just there from the very beginning. And I thought I needed to be a painter, but realized, well, whatever it is I'm interested in, I can't do it with paint so much. And then I'll say, yeah, I've got some paint in here. Anyway, but it's mostly fabric.
There's a nice relationship to liberation quilts, though.
Oh,
And
to what?
like liberation quilts and then like
Yes.
utopian ideals.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of just fabric as a kind of representation of this communal ideal is always there.
Yeah.
Stephen, you had a question?
In all that talk, I never once heard the word color. And both of you have a very particular and very different from engagement with color. I wonder if we can get some insights into how each of you thinks about color, or in these particular bodies of work. In particular.
Yeah. I think about color in terms of like light and dark in a way, and really the feeling of that, right? So like works before this show were much darker and in shadow, and I really thought a lot about like the feeling in which you encounter like immense shadow or light that kind of like penetrates your body, like waking up in the sun, the morning, like sun coming through the window. And I think about color in that way, lots of other ways too, but I think I'm more interested in the like emotive capacity of color than like any sort of theory or anything. A sensation.
Uh-huh. Well, in terms of my color, it's another interest I have in fabric is that it's found color, and so then it's a responsive reaction to the color. So it's there, and then I feel like if it's coming from a piece of existing fabric, clothing that I found in a bin, sometimes I feel like I can repair this, I can save it, I can make it work. And the palette tends to be bright because there's, at least in the state of Oregon, you have the beavers and the ducks, and then you have all this paraphernalia that exists as a result of just literally, yellows and oranges because of these preferred colors. So that's kind of just a responsive thing, and also there's been so much. There's all this protective roadwork color, safety gear. So yellow, green, and fluorescent orange, and it's just fascinating. It obviously stands out. If there's a bin full of these, used clothing items, obviously that's the thing you're going to go to because it's bright. And that was another thing I felt like, well, I can work with this. I can use this, and so it's very responsive. I tend to work with contrasts, and I don't worry too much about what the hue is. If there's a contrast, warm and cool, light and dark, or dull versus bright, I just set things up in that way. And more recently, I've dealt with symbolic color in terms of these yellows or oranges and blues, just because there's, oranges represent kind of warmth, earth, the water, the blue is like sky, water, and I'm trying to, talk about, kind of engage with environmental things, and so that then it sometimes takes on a symbolism, but also it's just reflecting what there's a lot of out there, because the backgrounds are all T-shirts, and so there's lots of orange and lots of blue. Because, for the very same reasons I am in kind of using the symbolism. Amy?
Mark, there's a kind of, you talk about fabric and your history with fabric, and obviously there's a lot of fabric in your work, mostly fabric, but when you talk, I feel like there might be a bit of a negation of some of the things that I think about as being sort of essentially fabric, like the way it folds or hangs, the drape of it. When you talk about going to the bins and finding things, I'm thinking about like gnarly, you know what I mean, used, like that's all like eradicated in your work, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that, it just, to me, it's so curious that I don't experience the things I normally experience with like fabric art, textile work.
Sure. Well, I have a little bit of a history in that when I was initially drawn to working with clothing, I was using it, and I would create these wooden armatures, cover them with clear upholstery vinyl, and then literally stuff the fabric into these armatures based on Stadia designs. But in that context, it was all about the wrinkles and the pockets and the kind of, but I was really fascinated with compression, just compressing these things, just like emptying the air out of them, which had a kind of like explosive quality. And I've just evolved with these. The idea of compression has maintained a kind of interest for me. I leave clues, but it's not so intentional. It's just they just happen to be there. There's still evidence that there maybe at one time were clothing. I think I'm not as concerned as I used to be about what the function was to begin with. It's just material. I feel like I'm going more towards representation as opposed to maybe communicating so much with the material itself. But now, for instance, there's a pocket from a T-shirt, so I kept that. Or there are traces of silkscreen from the, on the back side of the clothing, the piece of clothing. So it's there, but it's I suppose the function is not as important to me as it was earlier.
We're going to show one of those early ones in July and August as part of our art and sport show.
Yeah.
So you can see it.
Those are good.
One left. What?
Those are good.
Yeah, really great.
My favorite. They're like mosh pit paintings.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a different kind of like frenetic kind of thing going on with those.
I have a question about your process, the creation process. Do you literally, is it more linear? Once you've got the ideation and materials, is it more linear how you put them together?
Oh.
Or is it some hopscotch
Great question.
from the idea through, or is it
Sure.
a back and forth overall?
Sure. Thank you. Great question. So the question was about the process. How does a process evolve? Is it Is it just kind of like a piecemeal thing, and then it sort of evolves towards a more completed idea? No, I make a shape. I take a pencil or a brush and I make a shape, and then I make an outline. And then when it becomes an actual painting, I make a sketch, just like a painter would. I make a sketch of it, and it's a gesture of some kind that has some kind of meaning or content for me. And then with the fabric, I make a very careful outline, and then I just fill in the shape. and then the meditative aspect comes in when you do the infill, it just keeps telescoping inward and getting more and more minute and complex and crazy, and that seems to be the thing that keeps drawing me to it. The thrill of kind of just filling it in.
Do you start right in the middle of the painting like they say to never do? Just you start focusing right on the middle?
And with these mounds, it's really a simple process. You make there's a sort of a calculation in terms of each row has to get smaller and has to include more elements, so fewer squares, more squares, more squares, more squares, but also it has to taper in a kind of a subtle way. There's just a little math involved, but then I just make a row and then trim it so that it's nice and straight, and then make another row and make another row. It's just very straightforward. And then it's all about using contrasts and making sure I maintain contrast. It's very, very meditative, feels healthy.